What's up, everyone? Thank you so much for joining me for this week's podcast episode. First and foremost, I'd like to apologize for being so late on dropping it. As you guys know, I normally drop my episodes Monday night so that they are available for Tuesdays. However, last week was a week. On Monday, my computer decided that the operating system wanted to fail. And I freaked out. I drove it to Apple, almost practically crying, but not really. I was so concerned about my computer being hacked, having client data on there. I didn't want anything to have compromised any of that. So I drove to Apple and I was telling them scenarios of what was happening. And fortunately, I wasn't hacked. It was just my operating system that decided it just didn't want to work anymore, which is odd because it's a brand new computer. I got it only like a year and a half ago. So I had to ship it off and buy or get a whole new operating system for it. So I was really kind of off guard last week. I have an old computer. I think it's like 2013 that I used way back when. And it was so old, like my Bluetooth couldn't connect to it and stuff. Like I was struggling. I didn't have my two screens. And so all that to say, needless to say, I finally got my computer back, my work computer. So this is amazing. And finally, we're now getting back into the swing of things and playing catch up. And unfortunately, the podcast was a result of that delay because, if my two screens don't work, my advanced microphone probably wouldn't either. So thank you for bearing with me. I'm excited for today's conversation. I really want to talk a little bit more about measuring marketing. And this one isn't going to be the general, like you need to measure marketing in relation to revenue, and it only needs to be with closed won revenue and how marketing impacts the bottom line. I feel like we've all have been on this journey together. We realize that one of the things that is important to call out as we get down that journey of realizing that marketing is indeed measured on revenue is understanding how to communicate that internally effectively. And part of that has to go, especially if you're switching from a model before where you were measured on MQLs, not just high intent MQLs, right? Like just regular low intent MQLs and that model. If you are switching and modernizing marketing to then pivot to being measured towards revenue, how you talk about those initiatives matter internally because you need to set that expectation up for success, but then you also need to establish that trust and credibility as well. So what do I mean by that? A lot of companies either have weekly or monthly kind of like revenue meetings where they then open the pipeline. It's normally either marketing and sales or marketing, sales, and customer success with leadership. And everybody's talking about where we are on track with our targets, our revenue targets, how many calls the BDRs are getting or making, how many, demo requests the AEs have. Like everybody scrutinizes down to these numbers, right? If you are one of those individuals on a team that report off in that way, when you change your marketing strategy, the number one thing you need to make sure that you do is communicate the why and what you expect out of it. Will be a huge miss if you do not do this from the jump. Before you even start implementing your strategy, you need to set up the expectation of what we're going to expect and how we report weekly changes in respective to this change of strategy. So what do I mean by that? If on a weekly basis you are talking about how many MQLs you're getting and how many of those converted to an SQL, or even from a lead to an MQL, or from an SQL to an opportunity, whatever those numbers specific and conversion rates look like, if you're directly talking about those, but you're not talking about the bottom line and how this affects pipeline and revenue, then at the very minimum, you need to set up that expectation that we could still talk about these numbers if it makes sense to. My advice is to not, but we'll get into that here in just a little bit. What you need to do is talk about these new numbers that you're going to be reporting off of and why. And the reason for that is saying that because marketing is now going to change the strategy, we're doing this change of strategy because we know that it will be critical to success of driving more tangible business results, period. Okay, we'll pause there. From there, then we need to understand what are those KPIs that we need to have an understanding of in order to then hit these goals that we just told you about. So going back to this MQL to SQL conversion rate example, instead of showing up on a weekly basis and say, we got, thousands of MQLs, hooray, we only got 3 SQLs, we'll do better next week. Those conversations, they get stale time over time, right? Because the sales team looks to the marketing team to deliver those leads to help them with the demos. And if they don't, then they go out on their outbounding initiatives and they source their own pipeline, right? And then that's where that marketing and sales alignment really starts to kind of get a wedge in between, Marketing is sourcing these low quality leads. Sales is no longer reliant and trusting of marketing's leads. And so they go and they do their own thing. So when marketing finally gets one high intent lead, sales is like, cool. Maybe they'll work it. Maybe the trust is totally broken. But the likeliness of that being an ongoing thing where the sales is excited and cheering on for the marketing leads, that starts to fizzle out. And so when we talk about that conversion rate between an MQL to an SQL or an opportunity or whatever those numbers are that you directly report to, what you need to do when you're changing your strategy is jump up at the beginning of the meeting and say, hey, marketing has a really big announcement. Guess what? Everything we've reported on to date, throw it out the window. Here's why. Here's what we're going to be doing. And that way you're setting up the expectation that nobody's going to hear a specific MQL number from marketing, or nobody's going to hear a specific conversion rate from marketing in regards to, MQL to SQL and stuff like that. Conversion rates are still important. Don't get me wrong. So what we're pretty much doing is saying, we're raising our hand, we're admitting that we need to change a strategy, we're admitting that we're wanting to make that change, and then we're going to ask them to come along with this journey with us. So that means showing up, saying, hey, we're going to make this change. Are you with me? And then from there, the week afters, you're probably not going to see a really big spike, especially after you're just changing your strategies. The likeliness is that you're probably going to see a decrease because it's going to take time for your marketing strategy to ramp up a little bit, right? So you also need to communicate that too. So, hey, we're changing the strategy, everything throw out the window, and guess what? It's probably going to take us a few weeks to ramp up. So here's everything that we're going to be talking about in the meantime until we can really start seeing that ramp up for success. Some of the things to look at during that time is going to be an increase in website traffic. We want to make sure that we're drawing more people to the website to get more of those potential at-bats for the sales team. We also want to look at if you're doing a lot of paid advertising, especially on LinkedIn. If we're doing a traditional demand gen strategy where it's, ungated, maybe even videos, very much educational, more top of funnel. If you're doing that strategy on LinkedIn, a lot of the KPIs are more impression based. And sometimes you can measure the amount of impressions to your audience size and look at what that percentage is. Sometimes you're able to figure out a healthy percentage between what your audience size is versus how many impressions were actually shared to them. So sometimes if, your audience size is way too big, you could look at ways to segment that in order to get a better impression size to your audience size. So just some things to think about here as I digress. So, some of the things to look at, you're looking at website traffic, you're looking at ad impressions. Sometimes even CTRs can be important depending on, what that call to action is and what the objective is of that LinkedIn campaign. Sometimes you can even look at email engagement. If you're seeing if you have an engaged database, you can look at some webinar attendance or, live event attendance, registrations and attendance, right? Attendance, it's going to tell you how engaged and interested people are in your content. Registered, anybody can register, right? It's still an important metric to track, but you also want to make sure that you're getting that retention from attending the event as well. From there, those are going to be some of the foundational, hey, we're changing strategy. Here are some of the things to look at. If you can look at bounce rate, time on site, content engagement. All those things are leading indicators, right? So whatever makes sense for your strategy on the channels that you're working on to look at and to pull, set that expectation up of what we're going to look at until we can get the momentum going for this new strategy. Once we see that momentum, now we go back to the team and we're say, hey, guess what? We're seeing that traction. These are going to be the things that we are going to measure on going forward. The number one thing that you should start with is looking at anything that's closed won by marketing. Or if you don't have that yet, look at anything that's open pipeline. Okay. So that brings that level of trust and credibility where you're talking about how marketing is directly sourcing opportunities for the sales team. Those are really strong conversations and kind of proves your value to not only the sales team, but then the larger exec team as well, right? So if you have anything where marketing had sourced a closed won opportunity, this is the time to dig deep, take your screenshots, show all the different touch points and journeys and as much information as you can up there, and then couple that with the success of the sales team too. Whoever worked that opportunity and got it to close one, then, this is where you do your high fives, your hoorahs. Everybody feels good that we just won this really, really great, awesome account that is within our ICP. From there, if you don't have that closed one, right, we can then backtrack with open pipeline. Then we look at what accounts are in open pipeline, and if they match our ICP, how those conversations are going, how they're accelerating through the different stages, and what that looks like in relation to the stages that were with the prior strategy, if it's any faster, any better. And so those are going to be some of the things to look at for that. The next, backtracking a little bit further, if you still don't have anything for open pipeline, the next leading metric to look at are demo requests. If you are seeing an increase in demo requests, and are they the right requests from quality accounts that fit your ICP? From there, you can look at how many of those were actually scheduled and how many of those were done, right? The demos were completed. And then normally after demos are completed, they move into the pipeline stages. So really just depending on, sometimes it's an open pipeline at the point of demo being shown. Sometimes the demo is shown first and then they move into pipeline. Just all depends on your guys' sales processes. But the key thing that I want to call out for today's episode, and I'll wrap up here in just a second, is you cannot be afraid to you cannot, I cannot iterate this enough. You must, if you are wanting to change your marketing strategy, you must be willing to also stand up and say, everything that you've heard, throw out the window. This is what we're doing now. And if that doesn't come from you, it's got to come from your marketing leader, or it's got to come from, if there's a CRO that you report to, or even the CEO, depending on your company structure or your team structure, whatever leader that you look to for your performance metrics, if it's not you, then you need to talk to them about how they need to set that expectation in order for the entire team to be successful. So that's what I really wanted to focus today's conversation on is we cannot be passive in marketing. In today's day and age, marketing is anything but passive. We are bold, we are loud, we are exciting, we're authentic, we're raw, we're encouraging. And we need to be able to communicate that to the other go-to-market teams as well. And that's going to be critical for just having those connections within the other departments and getting their level of help and being able to use their expertise with your marketing campaigns, or use a person on the product team with your marketing campaigns, or somebody on the customer success team with your marketing campaigns. It's an integrated go-to-market approach. And so if we don't stand up and be the first ones that say, listen, we don't think we were on the right track, and so we're changing that, that raw, that authentic approach, and saying, I need you guys to join me and to help me in this direction. Normally that's well received, because at the end of the day, everybody wants the same outcome, right? So that's what I wanted to really cover for today's podcast episode. Thank you for your patience as I record and drop all of this. And of course, as always, see you next week.